Thank you. Mr. President, Honorable Senator Chief Fortune Charombira, Honorable members of the Bureau of PAP, Honorable colleagues, chairs of the African Legislative Councils, Honorable heads of delegations, ladies and gentlemen, I would like, first of all, to express to you, Mr. President, my sincerest thanks and gratitude for having kindly invited me to take part in the annual 11th Summit of the Heads of African Parliaments. I would also like to pay tribute to the choice made regarding the theme which you are intent on dealing with during this session, and which is of a central concern for the parliaments and governments, and more particularly for the peoples of Africa and the whole world. The African Union was right and forward-looking enough when choosing the year 2022 to be a year of nutrition and capacity building for the continent in the field of food security and in the consolidation of food agriculture. And this cannot be dissociated from the building of healthcare systems and social protection in order to increase the rate of human, social, and economic capital. Actually, the climatic phenomena which we went through, particularly during the year 2022, and notably the rise of temperature degrees, though presage some negative and extremely dangerous climate changes and disequilibria. Regrettably, these mutations concerned both the North and the South hemispheres and led to drought, hydric stress, and kindled forest fires. All this will inevitably have some negative repercussions on food sources and on the aggregate economic, social conditions, and ecological systems. Next to the aforementioned phenomena, the world economy has been faced with the disastrous repercussions of the spread of COVID-19. And while looking forward to an economic recovery, the world economy found itself faced with an unexpected rise in energy prices. This regrettably led to hold in leash of the positive economic dynamics witnessed in 2021. This had been observed in many economies. Consequently, and as a result of the war in Eastern Europe, the curve witnessed a downturn and the rise of transport costs in addition to a paucity of funding resources. But let us, dear colleagues, focus our discussions and proposals on the conditions of our African continent, which has suffered for so long a time from the scarcity of health services, from the acute water shortage, and from drought. Our continent is unfortunately paying the price of gas emissions, which lead to the rise of temperature degrees on Earth. Without cutting the fruits of industrialization, even more, Africa's contribution to those emissions does not exceed 4%, which leads to the deduction that Africa is much more a victim than a victimizer. Once again, this victim status is due to some international policies, the elaboration of which Africa has never contributed to. Rather, this is due to the overexploitation of the continent's resources, an exploitation whose benefits do not go to the African peoples and do not translate themselves into development projects, which would be expected to create some economic and social mutations that are expected to concretize the legitimate ambitions of the continent's populations. Next to the environmental factors, which hamper development in several African countries, the COVID-19 pandemic led to the holding back of the efforts formerly deployed in poverty mitigation. Consequently, and after the positive rise of development rate witnessed between 2015 and 2019, and testified by the United Nations, malnutrition and poverty resumed their spread in the continent at a moment when the rise in the population growth had been maintained. Most certainly, those indexes may know some substantial rise, and this may yet lead to a worsening of unemployment rates, a rise in the feeling of despondency and despair among a large category of our people, with a loss of trust in the future, especially the trust in this world order, which does not do justice to the African continent in the first place. In fact, the COVID-19 period has put to the test the world's solidarity with Africa. Feelings of selfishness grow higher. Accordingly, the countries of the continent had to face alone the pandemic and its repercussions with some scarce means and fragile health structure. Still, despite all these negative factors, our continent left the battleground with minimal casualties. In the context of crisis succession, of fierce competition over resources and sharp rise in needs of resources, we need to know, as African parliamentarians and as African elites, that we are at the crossroad of some decisive mutations. Those said mutations are expected to be massive and building for some new international relations based on the logic of profit. Accordingly, we need to consider in the right way our means and resources, just as we need to work hand in hand with some collective African spirit which had marked the period of struggle for national independence among all the African countries. The purpose for this is to build a new Africa which will arise from the ruins caused by political scissions, resource crisis, and scarcity. As institutions and actors, we need, first of all, to work on projects and policies which will help Africa take advantage of its resources. As His Majesty King Mohammed VI, may Allah glorify him, said at Addis Ababa in his historical address before the 28th Summit of the African Leaders on January 31st, 2017. The time has come for Africa to profit from its riches. After decades of looting the resources of the African lands, it is now necessary to create a new period of prosperity. End of quote. This royal invitation, 5 years after its having been launched, still has the same timeliness in the present international context, and this may be grounded on many considerations. First, Africa has some huge potentials which need to be converted into riches. The continent has 60% of the world's cultivable lands. Doubtless, the optimal, modern, and sustainable exploitation of these lands will provide food for the inhabitants of the continent and for a huge part of the world population. With respect to this, there is no need to remind anyone of the importance of food in the international present or future challenges. Second, our continent abounds in fishery resources which some 13 million square kilometers of African sea depth and 6.5 million square kilometers of African continental shelf which overflow with some huge resources. On the other hand, the 26,000 kilometers of the African coastline may constitute a field for some gigantic activities, continental and international trade exchanges, which may prove to be both massive and beneficial. Most certainly, we shall not diverge when it comes to the considerations of these sea possibilities concerning the production of wealth, the provision of food, and the creation of job opportunities. To this shall be added the process of development, especially when we take into consideration the fact that oceans contribute by 50% to the world food supply, in addition to their being a means of communication and world trade. Third, more than that, our continent also hosts young human resources, which, if receiving the right kind of training, may contribute to the conversion of these potentials into attractive resources of wealth. This in turn will be made into resources of stability and hope in the face of frustration and the desire of migrating abroad, which are both nurtured by despair and unemployment. 4, this way, our countries will be able to develop a sustainable agriculture thanks to the huge water resources available in many of our countries, provided that the said resources be rationally mobilized, soundly and diligently utilized. Once again, I shall recall with you the international water challenge to be faced during the 21st century. Mr. Chairperson, dear colleagues, by going back to the climatic disequilibria and with the rise of the energy source prices, we too need to sense the importance of clean energy sources which our continent overflows with and which obviously need technology and funding. In this context, world solidarity and international cooperation become at stake, especially in Africa. Concerning health services in Africa, please allow me to recall the fact that the COVID-19 pandemic has given rise to some selfish tendencies on the part of some rich and technologically advanced countries. To that effect, we have experienced and gone through the monopoly by some sources of vaccine technology and means of protection as well as medical equipment. Should there be some reaction to come up with and lessons to draw from this context, we should say that efforts should be to the settings of cooperation system between the African countries. Medical production units must be created and South-South cooperation must be encouraged. This will hopefully bring back the African skills and brains and boost scientific research and dynamic to the African soil. As parliamentarians, we need to plead internationally for this purpose. We must secure medicines for all and lift off all the boundaries and barricades which stand in the way of creating an independent African pharmaceutical industry, particularly patents which are used as a means for the perpetuation and justification of monopolies. As parliamentarians, we must also plea for the transfer of technology into Africa and work for facilitating the return of African brains to their homelands. The purpose will consist of making the multinationals implemented in Africa and taking advantage of the continent's huge resources. It will also consist of contributing to these high economic and social profitability projects on the ground of investment and partnership, not on the ground of assistance and help. Most certainly, it will be possible for the African institutions and agencies that have been created to that effect to constitute a framework for the coordination of the results reached through this parliamentary plea and through the relating continental policies. Dear colleagues, the objectives mentioned above fall within the central scope which aims at consolidating and developing the continent's human and economic capital. Besides, those objectives are at the heart of human rights and constitute the core of democratic values. To that effect, it is the parliaments which, as institutions, take the forefront position in the personification of those values, and when it also comes to their being entrusted with those values. To reach those objectives, we are requested to set a political framework and make some coordinated efforts that must be deployed internationally. We must also come up with some simplified national legislations and public policies whose supervision, control, evaluation, implementation, and quality control must be supervised by the Parliament. The Kingdom of Morocco, under the leadership of His Majesty, King Mohammed VI, has proven its full involvement in this continental horizon. To reach this end, the Kingdom has relentlessly being involved in pleading for the causes of South-South partnership and showing in its preference for this kind of cooperation on the ground of reality. This has taken shape in the kingdom's huge investments in a number of countries in the light of win-win logic. Hence, 60% of the Moroccan investments abroad are directed towards Africa. The African farmhouses, in addition to the AAA initiative launched by His Majesty King Mohammed VI with a number of his African brothers during the COP22 summit held at Marrakesh in 2016, represent some examples of wealth-producing and poverty-deflecting cooperation. The purpose here is to reduce the African fragility and its agriculture in the face of climatic disequilibria, and the promotion of some agricultural projects in a number of African countries. The OCP, l'Office chérifien des phosphates, can today be considered as an African leader in the field of fertilizing, developing, and condensing African agriculture. It is presently in the process of supporting the development of agriculture in several African countries. If our continent happens to be at the heart of many international challenges, and if it happens to be at the heart of an international race, this is because it abounds with some huge potentials. Consequently, we as Africans need to ask ourselves about the hindrances that stand in our way and which prevent us from putting into place some African cooperation strategies which must be guided by the logic of South-South cooperation. Whatever the answer to this question, the present context imposes on us the rereading of some postulates. It also requires us to show some modesty, to rid ourselves of the dregs of the Cold War and its aftermaths, and make the interests of African continents and people a top priority of our continental work. Having at its disposal some advanced expertise and in several sectors such as agriculture, sea fishing, water resource mobilization, renewable energies, healthcare, generalization, fighting epidemics, and food security, the Kingdom of Morocco is permanently ready to continue its partnership with its brothers in Africa. It does this on the basis of the belief of common gain and interest, and on the basis of the respect of the brothers' choices, institutions, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. This it also does on the basis of modesty and interchangeable profits. Mr. Chairperson, dear colleagues, I'm one of those Africans who are fully convinced that ours is the continent of the future and youth. Accordingly, and in order to secure the African ascension, we must learn from history and from the practices of others regarding unity and relations between nations. We must also learn from the exemplary and common exploitation of our resources for the sake of our people and the prosperity of our countries. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you.